Chapter 3. The Hunt. Weekdays after school, Will would earn his stripes at his father's place of business. He was dutiful, diligent, and dulled out of his mind. He held no ambition for the crisp, clean bleached white coat whose breast pocket would contain one comb, one pair of scissors, sharpened nightly, and a daily accumulated multicolored array of hair. Each evening Mr. Templeton would shine his black leather shoes after a good whisking of the tiny salt and pepper hairs fallen between the laces. Actually, Will enjoyed helping his dad and often volunteered to brush and shine the shoes. He'd go out on the front step while his mother busily prepared dinner, and his father was occupied with pipe and paper. Any excuse to stay outside was worth the work to attain it. Will loved watching the carts and horses go by. The men tipped their hats, most often filled with well-groomed heads. The ladies might nod politely beneath their parasols, bonnets, or veils. Dogs would just keep walking after a whiff or two of the black polish, and those passers-by sporting horseless carriages would be of particular interest to young William. These speed demons were starting to appear, rolling through the town more frequently. They were a great mystery. At no time did he feel more a part of something than his evenings on the step, with the neighbors out on their steps. This was especially true after the dinner hour in the cool before twilight. The air would hint of sweet pipe tobacco, drifting from one porch to the next. Earlier there had been the most welcomed aromas of peach, berry, hot apple, cinnamon and spice, freshly baked in pies, cooling in window-sills and offered up to all the neighborhood. Father would fill his rocking chair, mother her wicker, and Will would return to the wooden porch step, second from the top. This was the way it was. This was summer. In a matter of seconds, it would change forever. His mother leaned forward in her high-back wicker chair, reached around and tugged at a string wrapped once round her waist and tied behind in a bow. She lifted off the slightly faded white and red patterned apron and began to fold it neatly on her lap, when suddenly she remembered something, safely tucked in its single pocket. "Oh, I almost forgot, William," she said with some casual interest. "Mr. Grebbs brought this for you today." She held her hand to Will's. "It had your name on it, dear, so I didn't open it." It smelled faintly of apple and spices. By now his father too had leaned forward. His puffing had all but stopped, and the previous exhalation of smoke seemed to hang motionless in the air in equal expectation. On more than one occasion, Grebbs had stated how he enjoyed delivering mail to the Templeton home. Unlike so many others, they had no dog, determined to attach itself to his pant leg. Will felt some relief in knowing that this note was too unseasonably timed to be from his school, but whatever could the postman have for him? He opened his hand to read his name, beautifully transcribed on the envelope. He looked up at his parents, looking down at him. This was not a moment of privacy. It was not his birthday, and his Aunt Letty from Philadelphia had not remembered it. He stuffed the envelope into his shirt and turned swiftly on his bottom to face the front of their white-slatted two-story home on Evans Street. With a "Thanks, Mom," he was through the door. A moment later, his parents, now staring at each other, heard the faint wooden slap of the screen door in the back of the house. The pipe smoke continued on its spiraling path across the porch. When Will reached the spot by the river, under the willow, He sat naturally cross-legged like an Indian brave below the leafy sway. The shadows were long and the colors sweet and sparkly. He reached into his tunic and slid his little finger under the sealed flap, carefully tearing open the envelope. The paper inside was folded, clean, and crisply. He admired that, for some reason, as if it was meant for one purpose alone, and there it was. He reached in and slowly slid the paper into view. Unfolding its 2 long creases, he read the contents. Dear William Templeton, forgive me for writing so boldly. I do not wish to be improper in doing so, but I feel you may be the one person I can turn to in a most delicate matter. Will stopped reading and looked up across the river. This was from Leah. Dare he read further? Dare he not? He dared read further and fixed his eyes onto her words. Over the course of the past year, you and my brother Geoffrey have become the closest of friends. This is well understood by my family, and I am certain yours as well. Despite our differences of background and position in town, we have come to think of you as a young man of integrity and determination. In some ways, you are like a part of the family. I feel that I can trust you with a request. Will's young heart was pounding as he read, with eyes that traced each flow, loop, swirl, and dot of Leah's pen as though they were the form of the woman herself. It is with much sadness that I must tell you that my brother Geoffrey is missing. Like a rock thrown to the bottom of the river, Will's heart then sank. The day before yesterday, he was to go to the library. He had become preoccupied lately with his studies and something else. He said he had found something he needed to research. That's all he would say. He left in the morning, and when he hadn't returned by supper, Father went out looking for him. The library, yeshiva, and shul were all closed, and there was no sign of Geoffrey. That evening, we informed the police, and they very well may contact you if he doesn't come home soon. The letter continued. I know you hadn't seen much of each other the last few weeks, but I felt I needed to contact you myself. William, if you know of his whereabouts or can assist in any way, I'd be most eternally grateful to you. During much of the past year, you were Geoffrey's closest companion. We are so afraid he may be hurt or in some kind of trouble. Please contact me as soon as possible, William. I will help you in any way I can. I await your reply. Yours truly, Leah Rebecca Asher. Will sat silently, holding the page before his face. His eyes simply fell on the words, no longer reading them. In the waning light, he could feel a breeze gently pass over him. The water before him and the leaves above both moved in turn, in their own way, but he could not. His lips parted, and he felt his lungs quickly draw a deep breath. His eyes closed. What was happening? Where was Geoffrey? Will silently asked the tree and the breeze and the darkness and God. He opened his eyes, and nothing had changed. He heard a cicada buzz somewhere in the distance of branches and grass. The river glowed in the setting sun, and Geoffrey was somewhere across there. Or could he have come over here to this side of the river, or into the river, or met with that gang of boys again? There were so many places a boy might hide or be hidden. Another day would roll by with the breeze, the tide, and the curling dawn to dark. There would be no clap of thunder, no rolling back of clouds to revelation. As hidden as summer from the cold, closed lips of January was the boy. It was too late to look tonight. He would return to the house and show Leah's letter to his parents. In the morning, he would try to understand. With the dawn and dew came the rising of the boy. Will ran downstairs in the usual way, and there, waiting for him in the usual way, were chores and breakfast, in that order. But Will himself was feeling quite unusual. Sun and summer, the raft and explorations always seemed so much fun. Fall and harvest, leaves in piles and pumpkins in pies were all just a treat, just a lark. The world was a game, and Will had invested as narrowly and quickly and cleverly as the gamester. He stepped lightly and lively and never made much of an impression in the ground, not so much as to be held in one spot. This was different. He couldn't quite figure it out, but things somehow were different inside. He just couldn't slide away. This time he was stuck. How on earth could he help in something so above and beyond his ability? He remembered something his uncle had told him. Des once showed him drawings of Egypt land. The elder Templeton often taught him things about an ancient world. Will recalled an Egyptian story being preached in one of his short-lived forced forays into Sunday school, but Uncle Des told it better. For William, Sunday school was as dry as Monday to Friday school, but somehow Des had a way of making old things real. Will once asked, if those pyramids were so big and heavy, just how did those old Egyptians ever build them? Des hadn't the answer. Instead, he said there were men alive today who knew that kind of hidden knowledge, but they pretty much kept it to themselves. But I can tell you one secret thing about how they, whomever they were, made the pyramids, my boy, the uncle answered. Those magnificent, impossible structures were built one block at a time. That's all, Will. Just one block at a time was all that mattered. Remember that when you get older and start to feel the weight of the world is on your shoulders. You're not sinking down, son. You're moving blocks. You will build your life one heavy block at a time until at last you reach the stars. Remember, Will, there's no accidents in the structure of your life on this swirling earth. Everything, every event fits into place precisely and perfectly for the positioning of the next. They are all carved and fashioned by you and another, unseen by you. But you must carry them alone until it's time to set them down. Des laughed and patted Will's shoulder. I don't expect you to understand this, Will. Not yet. But you will when you need to. I must be content with that, for that is one of my blocks. Des laughed again. Will's attention returned to the kitchen, the here and now. The weekend was upon him. His parents, having read the letter, naturally wished to help the Ashers in any way possible. But how? Surely this was within the scope of the authorities and their expertise in missing persons. Will had one advantage. He knew the woods, most of them. He knew the river. He knew the hunt and the places he and Geoffrey had explored and claimed together. With a promise to be careful, his parents' permission, and some sandwiches packed in a rucksack, he would retrace his old haunts. Well, perhaps it wasn't much, but it was something, and Will would do it gladly. Though, even as he walked through his backyard to the taller grass of the field that eventually joined the river, he knew that Geoffrey would be in none of those places. It was not like Jeff to roam on his own. He was curious about books and scrolls and ways of words, not brooks and shoals and ways of woods. And so, with the raft uncovered of reeds and unfastened from its mooring, Will set out on the Wahani. Still and quiet this morning, the river allowed for much travel, but confided little else to the boy. He returned to the place where he'd first found the skiff, to the ruins of the old mill far upstream and various shady spots along the way. Revisited was a tree fort they'd made and a sandbar where they'd spent hours and afternoons that summer, wading in the water and skipping the flattest stones the farthest. Will stopped to rest and eat, and noticed a crow working its way up a tree from the inside. From branch to branch, the bird picked an opening and jumped up to it. The dark creature was really quite graceful, like a dancer in his leaps and turns. As with all things, his ascension had a limit. The branches were finite and thinning as he reached the top, yet he showed no intention of stopping his ambitious climb. At last he reached the uppermost branch and remained there still and silent, within adequate cover of a tuft of young leaves behind which he simply waited and looked down on the scene. The crow, however, was unaware that he too was being observed in all he did. How easily could Mr. Templeton take out Mr. Crow? Will smiled to himself and continued on his way. He did not believe in hunting for sport. If killing were truly sporting, then dumb animals would have rifles, the chances then being evened. Just because a thing could be done did not mean it should be done. For Will, there was no sport in domination or meanness. He took no pleasure in power. When he hunted, he would hunt for survival. But he thought it wise, from time to time, to notice what the crows were up to. Eventually, 2 of the packed sandwiches had come and gone, and there was little left to do but pull the boat ashore and proceed afoot to more treacherous ground. He would pay a call on a residence deep in the woods, the cabin home of one Bill Nunes. Nunes was no friend to the boys, but he was no villain, or so it was assumed. Young William, however, not entirely sure about that, found himself compelled to the woods behind the cabin. He crouched in the thicket, watched and waited. A long while passed. To Will, every moment there seemed like an eternity, yet he heard not a click nor stir from the buzzard of a man. He would edge closer to the shack. It was now, Will thought, he'd cash in on his little insurance policy. He pulled on the leather strap that had been hanging across his back, quietly loaded a cartridge into the breech of his rifle, and pulled back the bolt. Will believed in taking chances, but not ridiculous ones. He had no intention of shooting anyone, but every intention of using any deterrent to his getting shot this day. It would be rifle against shotgun now. Perhaps Nunes would think twice before pulling any trigger if he saw one equally available to focus its sights on him. Closer Will crawled, on his belly like a Yankee soldier, till crouching on his knees and elbows, he was up against the wooden slats of the cabin's left side. He peered through a crack between boards, but could see nothing in the darkened interior. Will pressed his ear to the wood. The unsettling quiet here made no mention of Nunes. Ever so carefully, he edged to the corner. Keeping low, he held his breath and slowly offered his forehead around the corner, just enough to see the front. There was the porch, and the lone chair, sitting just this side of the door. It was sparse and barren, with or without Noons. This time it was without. Will breathed out and eased his grip on the rifle stock. He wiped the sweat from his palm to his shirt, but kept the gun bolt pulled back just in case. The boy was not out of the woods yet. Noons could very well be inside, perhaps with Geoffrey as hostage. Will could not very well stride up to the front door and knock. He thought for a moment, then grabbed a small handful of pebbles at his knees and tossed them onto the porch. There was silence. Only the tree-tops, in a sudden breeze, gently nodded to one side. The porch and cabin made no motion either to catch or condemn him. If Will was trespassing, he was doing it to his knowledge alone. He would go inside. The single step up creaked, and the porch was uneven and warped in the middle, likely not from the wear of welcome company, but the usual presence of one in that spot. He slowly opened the screen door and held it there with his shoulder, keeping his shooting hand free. His left hand reached for the main door latch. Will turned his head and looked back one last time to notice only the treetops above, again nodding. He unhooked the latch, and the door nearly opened itself, slowly but completely, coming to a stop at his right. He now faced the darkened room. He was taking an awful chance being there, as now he was knowingly in the wrong. William was sneaking into a man's house, and that man would be within his rights to shoot him dead. "Hello?" whispered Will. "Hello? Is anybody there?" In that void of seconds, lasting an eternity, the answer echoed a return of yes. He himself was there, but Noons was not. Will took a step forward and closed the door behind him. Except for some hesitant daylight passing through the two windows on either side of the door, and one in the far left side wall, there was no special brightness in this place. Will could see a tobacco pouch and a stack of small, square papers on a squarish table in what appeared to be living quarters. There was also a black iron stove in the center of the cabin. Wood was strewn in piles on both sides of the door he had just entered. On one pile rested a tin box and a handful of matchsticks, offering themselves like quills. He pulled one and scraped it against the rough wood-board wall. Will turned to face the room that shelters Bill Noons. The image shocked the boy, who thought himself worldly. The place was an unearthly mess. Stacks of empty cans, bottles, and newspapers lay in heaps and were strewn and spread like piles of leaves in the fall. But here no pickup was ever intended. Will had not imagined Noons as a reader, and this find seemed odd. But the newspapers, he supposed, were fuel for the fire. Bits of food lay where they had fallen, complete with feathers and bones. The stench made Will cover his mouth with the crook of his elbow and breathe as shallowly as he could. Surely the grouse and God knows what other animals and their parts had been consumed in this room night after night. There appeared to be a kitchen in the far right, with a food cabinet near a table, a carving knife stuck in a block of freshly oiled cheese glinted in reflection of the burning match. There was a cot in the left back corner of the room, close to the other remaining and covered window. On this side of the cot sat an overturned crate functioning as a table. There on top was a kindling hatchet, its blade embedded in the crate, just far enough to leave it in what appeared to be a position of readiness. The room was devious and compelling, repulsing and completely insane. The world had been withdrawn from this vacuum, and in its place was hung a frightening emptiness with claws and time, much time to prepare. He did not look in the closet. William had seen enough and turned back for the door. He almost made it there, but something stopped him. Something literally pulled at Will from the inside and made him pivot on his heel to once again face the cot in the corner. He approached it. As he walked closer, he could see under the window 3 boxes of shotgun shells, one overturned and left there on the floor for immediate future use. He did not see the shotgun, and that worried him, for that meant its owner was holding it. Once again, Will pulled on the shoulder strap to swing around and balance his own protection along his right hand and forearm. Beside the cot, under the half-buried hatchet, inside the bottom of the crate, lay a sort of cloth. There was obviously something below this cover. He carefully lifted the material, half expecting to find a rat trap or perhaps a rat. To his amazement, this was not a rag, but what remained of a threadbare and motionless woman's dress. What on earth was Noons doing with a dress? Will could not imagine Noons even liking women, or they him. The once-lit match had long ago since burned to completion. Will strained to see the gown, holding it up to the aspects of light peering through the shrouded side window. The gingham dress must have been quite attractive in its day, when it was white, with streams of blue and turquoise throughout. Now it was little more than rags, well loved and well lost. Beneath the folds of this cloth, at the bottom of the crate, lay a box, no wider than one that might carry cigars, though it was twice as deep and, even in this dingy room, looked exceptionally dark. Will held it to his ear and shook it once. All that answered was the rattle of the lock and clasp. He had come too far inside not to go the final step. With knife in hand, he pried the lock till it simply gave way and opened itself to him without a struggle. What secret had Noons been hiding? What secret would Will the intruder now have to keep locked up in himself? He unfastened the hinge lid and looked inside, straight into the image of his own face. It was a newspaper clipping of the trial months before, with a photo of both he and Noons, and the words in bold typeface, "Boy accused of murder, found not guilty." The word "not," although recognizable, had been deliberately crossed out several times. Under this were various clippings of persons unknown to Will. Then, to his amazement, was a lone photograph of a man who looked distantly like Noons, though unclenched and unseasonably happy, beside a remarkably beautiful, dark-haired young woman. In the background, just behind the two, was a face he recognized. Standing there was his beloved Uncle Desmond. When William lowered his gaze from the tintype in his hands to the hinged container, his heart nearly stopped. There, in the bottom of the box, rested the handkerchief with the scarlet thread running round its edge. It was half his life ago when he had last seen it, but he knew it was the self-same one. Just then, Will heard the snap of branches outside. Someone was coming near. There was not time, or indeed any way of escape from the cabin undiscovered. Neither could he stay where he was. He hurriedly replaced things as he had found them and ran to the door, gun in hand and head a-whirl. He felt sick to his stomach and chilled to the bones. There he waited, backed up against the spill of logs beside the door, unable to move. He could only watch, for in a matter of seconds it happened. The latch lifted from its hole, and the door swung open. It slapped against the pile of logs where he stood, barely missing his face. He could hear a dragging sound of feet to floor under the burden of unnatural weight. There was a grunting and wheezing and words, unpleasant words. Then a figure emerged, past the door edge, and shuffled into sight. Will could not see the face of this grotesque figure as it walked hunched over, both arms carrying the large burlap sack containing something near to drop. Thank God the door still remained open, shielding both the figure and Will from seeing each other. The man stumbled to the center of the room and violently pulled his arms from the sack. It hit the floor with a dull thud. The figure doubled over, both hands clutching his knees, his head down, and his mouth gulping breaths. Will knew it was now or never. He must get out before that man stood up. He thrust his left foot just past the open door, grabbed the door with his free hand, and immediately swung the rest of his body around, pivoting on the planted ball of his foot. Propelled by fear or force or sheer foolishness, in a second he had arched around the door without making a sound, and was now facing the opening, with his back to the figure. In that moment, which felt to Will as a lifetime, a million thoughts rushed through his head, the last of which was what he saw there in the center of the room. The bag, its mouth half opened, revealed a heap of sticks and twigs and kindling wood overspilling from its belly, above which the now rising figure of Bill Noons had snapped his head around to catch the eyes of the boy he most despised. In that instant, though not a word was uttered between them, they both knew that now nothing could be hidden. Will ran like he had never run before. He did not turn around. He did not look where he leapt, straight into the woods, deeply and without provision for what might be before or behind. He ran and ran and ran. There was no thinking, no stopping, no turning back. He was stuck and committed on a journey, not of his choice, but of his consequence. On the far side of Noon's cabin lay a stretch of land known as the Bluffs. A few 100 feet into the woods, travelers would meet with the edge and a sharp drop into a deep gully. One must carefully traverse the steep, eroded bank and network of both standing and toppled trees, with their root systems thrust out of the ground in a mad display. The land was loose and rocky and rugged. Many a son was told to stay away from the bluffs. Many a son had no intention of listening. Will was no friend of heights, and he kept far from the edge. Eventually, the land evened out to a gradual slope, where a narrow stream, an attachment to the Wahani, trickled and bled. This was unwelcoming country. Will preferred the high ground and his familiar haunts along the river or south to Simon's Pass. This day, as the sun was falling and the air was cooling, and the chest of a running boy, was screaming for rest, he paid little attention to exactly where he had run. Eventually, he had to stop and take a breather. His insides would burst should he push them any further. With the rifle still clutched in his right hand, he came to a stop. His head was throbbing to the pound of his heart. Even his ears felt exhausted under pressure. He leaned on his left knee and took a few deep, desperately needed breaths. He must have run full out for miles. Straightening up and finally looking back, there was no sign of a soul. Nunes was caught so quickly off guard, he hadn't time to reach for his shotgun, let alone load it and point it at the rabbit of a boy. Now what? Will was no farther ahead in his quest, except to have seen that Geoffrey was not in the cabin. At least not now. Will suspected he would surely feel the sharp sting of the strap for his little excursion indoors, and he supposed there'd be more grouse to bag for the hermit from the hedge. It was getting late. He'd better double back the long way round and head for home. He had permission to search for his friend, but not stay the night in the woods. Besides, he thought, his provisions were nearly exhausted. That is, all but his pocket full of cartridges. He could kill and cook a wild bird, but the shot would alert Nunes to his location, should he be on the prowl out there after him. Within a few paces homeward, Will urgently realized another pressing need out there among the wilderness. Nature was suddenly calling. He figured it was okay to water the plants, so to speak. He leaned his rifle against a tree and unbuttoned his breeches. It was there and then, in that most vulnerable of necessities, that a kind of undeniable darkness fell over William. He had not perceived a sound or scent out of season or a shadow out of sequence, but somehow he could just feel that something was wrong, as surely as the dankness in the air and sorrow in his heart. He felt as though he were an animal caught in a trap, only waiting for the trapper. Will knew, there and then, that he was being watched, and a hunter of men was now standing directly behind him.